Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced the best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back, breathe in good oxygen, and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. As we just celebrated, honored, and remembered another important MLK Day, I want to share with you a powerful conversation we had this past October as a part of my Thermostat Cultures live event in Columbus, Ohio. This year, it was a hybrid event with limited VIP seating in person and many other virtual participants from around the world. I was honored to facilitate this conversation with my good friends and people who inspire me, Kevin Clayton, VP of Diversity and Inclusion with the Cleveland Cavaliers, Ken Boyer, EY's America's Inclusiveness Recruiting Leader, and Lashandra Baker, Senior Director for Employee Engagement and DEI at National Church Residencies. I hope this conversation that is the currency for change inspires you to think about the progress being made with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the steps we still need to make into the future. To learn more about future Thermostat Culture live events, visit thermostatcultureslive.com throughout the year.
One of the obvious things that's happened over the last couple of years, for sure, is talk around diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's been one of the most hot topics, of course, and there's been a lot of, over the last couple of years, we know this, that there's been angst, there's been division, there's been challenging things that have happened in the world that have, fortunately, pushed this conversation to places where we got to talk about it. And so when I talk about leadership development, and we talk about the cultures that we're creating, you'll remember me saying many different times that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not an add-on. It's not something that's an afterthought. It's a part of the way that we lead. It's a part of the culture that we create. And certainly moving into a world that is, we want leaders to be more inclusive and open, and also creating cultures where we can nurture the potential and the spirit of every human being, that's going to be even more important. And so I'm excited to have some other guests back with us to carry a conversation really that we began last year together. So I'm going to invite up some guests to come join me up here on the stools. The first one I'll invite up is my friend Kevin Clayton. Kevin is the VP of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for the Cleveland Cavaliers and the companies associated with the Cleveland Cavaliers. He is somebody that I have become good friends with, and is somebody that was a part of last year's TCL, the virtual component, and so excited to welcome him back to add some value to this conversation. Lashandra Baker, La, come on, get up here, La. So Lashandra Baker, formerly with Cover My Meds, you may remember that conversation that we had last year together. Hi, La. And now with National Church Residencies, employee engagement, and then also diversity, equity, inclusion. Wonderful spirit, and great to have her a part of this conversation. And then another OG for TCL, Ken Boyer, who is the Inclusiveness Recruiting Leader across the Americas for EY. My guy, Kenny Boyer. How are you? We need to have this conversation, and excited to have this conversation with you all, because as you've heard me say, diversity, equity, inclusion is not an add-on. It is a part of the way that we show up to lead in the world, and it's about creating cultures that nurture the human spirit and potential of all people. And so we, as a society, we've got to continue to progress and get better at this. Last year, as a part of the virtual, when we had to pivot and go all virtual last year with TCL, one of the most powerful conversations we had is in the wake of everything that was happening in the world, certainly George Floyd and everything that happened there, I think, brought it to the national and global consciousness. But certainly then these were not new things. These were things that have been happening for generations. And yet we started a conversation which, what is the role that we all play as leaders? And then how do we, not perfectly, but how do we be the people that stimulate progress and create cultures that are welcoming to people and stimulating progress. So welcome back. And I'm excited to hear from you. 1 year later, after that conversation, 1 year later, where do you see progress has been made in diversity, equity, inclusion, at least this narrative, this conversation, this development? What do you see? Kev, lead us off, buddy. Yeah.
So first, thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. I have mixed emotions around actually what I see, and I don't want to make it emotional because there's facts that support it. But part of the emotional side of me is that in a lot of cases, organizations made these great statements. There was this initial cutting of a check, and there were the increase of particularly African Americans now in leadership positions, and that was it. That ain't diversity. That's making a statement, cutting a check, hiring a few folks. Then on the other hand, there has been substantive change across the landscape where organizations have made DE&I a part of the culture. One of the comments earlier, we were talking about values. In a number of organizations, you have now seen the wording of diversity, inclusion, equity as part of the values. If you don't connect the work of DE&I into the value system of the organization, then it's really more of a program of the month, program of the year. So for me, it's still a wait and see, but I have seen some progress. Disappointingly, I've seen a lot of major organizations, corporations provide lip service and a Band-Aid.
We're going to get to that in a second. We're where opportunities or where we still see opportunity to stimulate that kind of progress. But what can we see, at least from my vantage point, there's been progress, but certainly not enough. We're going to get to it in a second. But where have you seen progress?
I've seen progress. First of all, thank you for being here, and I love being with these guys up here. The one rose among the thorns. So one of the things that I saw that was meaningful to me is that white people saw racism as their problem as much as it was a problem for people of color. I think the narrative throughout history is that this is our problem that we are dealing with, but it's not, because we are not always the ones in power who have the ability to change, right? So it's a joint effort that we have to think about, how do we work together? And also racism impacts us all, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, all of it. So how do we move beyond where we were to make a difference, not just now, but for all of our future generations who have to inherit this world that we're leaving them to?
Yeah, I think for me, one, great to be here. Great to be with this group. I didn't realize you calling me a rose. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Just kidding a lot. I think for me, Jason, I have seen some change, some positive change. It's funny, we were talking about values. I was thinking about the firm's values, right? Shout out to my EY folks who are here and online. People who demonstrate integrity, respect, teaming, and inclusiveness is one of the firm's values. So that makes me proud, right? There's still a lot of work to be done. I'm seeing it showing up in boardrooms. I'm seeing it showing up in our clients. The discussions around DEI at the boardroom level where I've never seen it before. And Kevin, I agree, there's a lot that needs to be done, but at least the discussions are happening. And I'm being asked to engage a lot more with our clients on this topic. The other piece that I've seen over the course of the year that employees or staff are holding organizations accountable for those statements. So I've seen, a lot of people have issued statements and checks, and many have backed off. But I've also seen the other side where the employers are saying, you did issue a statement. What are we going to do? Where are we going? I think that's been incredibly positive. So long way to go, but I've seen some slight change, and I'm the eternal optimist. I think from a leader perspective, I pride myself on being a healthy agitator when it comes to DEI. And I'd encourage all of you to be a healthy agitator in your respective organizations and companies as well.
So raising that level of consciousness certainly is a beginning part. But as we've talked about and I even said to you all last time, and I see Lori Turner on the screen there. Hi, LT. I'm going to come to you in just a second because she was a part of this great virtual conversation that we had last year as a part of Education for Leadership Equity. I want to talk to her in just a second. But the raising it into the consciousness and beginning to have that conversation, but my commitment to everybody was that this wasn't going to just be, remember that 1 year we talked about this thing. This is again, it's not an add-on. It's a part of the way that we lead and the way that we show up, and that we as human beings and as a world right now, I think are still making sense of how do we stimulate progress in this area. And so, where do you see opportunities for progress? That yes, we've begun to make some progress, but where do you see opportunities for us to continue to grow and develop?
Can I jump in?
Please.
Okay. All right. I know, right? All right. So let me connect the dots for the initial statement that I made around yes and no. I have seen some things. So for me, here's where progress can be seen. When you institutionalize DE&I, just like you institutionalize every other thing in your organization, when it becomes part of the compensation system, when it becomes part of the promotion system, we talked about onboarding. When you look at DE&I and say, how does that affect the onboarding as well? Because everybody does not need to or prefers to be onboarded into an organization the same way. So when you look at all the systems that are in the organization and have a DE&I overlay to that, that's when you begin to see progress. Not DE&I over here with the one person of color who's now the chosen DE&I leader and the rest of the organization over here. And it's okay, well, Kevin, La, you're responsible for that when the rest of the organization is here. The other thing, and I made the comment relative to if the progress was made where there was some people of color that were now put in higher positions. You talked about board groups. That still isn't diversity. Diversity is when everybody in this room that looks how we all look, that have multiple dimensions of diversity, see yourselves as part of the DE&I puzzle, not just people of color or the oppressed people in an organization. So when it becomes institutionalized, where it's just how we do things, and it's not an event, and that's what I'm seeing now, that it's still an event with a lot of organizations, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, 100% agree with Kevin. When you think about inclusion, it means your voice is added to the conversation. It means you are a part of the decision making. It means you are part of the culture add we talked about before. And if you don't do that at the literally the basic level from start all the way to finish, you're not going to do it. Like, you have to ingrain it into the organization. It has to work into the rhythm of the organization. So everybody is not going to all of a sudden say, okay, we're just going to fire everybody and now we're going to hire everybody for people of color. That's not going to work. Because that's going to, first of all, cause animosity and resentment and a whole bunch of other things. It's like, how can you be a part of this conversation? Where are we falling short? What do you think we need to do? Okay, now that you think we need to do that, how are you going to be a part of that? People have to be a part of the solution. It's not just a top down saying, we got to go do this now. It's like, I want to do this. I want to see somebody who looks like me standing up there. I want to see people who looks like my friend who happens to be gay up there, right? Representation matters, but power also matters, right? You can't just have a bunch of people in a room with zero power. All the people of color, all the different people who have been historically marginalized can't just be at the front line. They have to be throughout the organization, part of the decision making, a part of the leadership, all through.
Yeah. For me, I'll take a slightly different direction. I think for me, it's still troubling, right? You see the division in the country. Certainly, the passion around this particular topic, and the divisiveness. I mean, we still have an incredibly long way to go to bridge this gap here. And I have a high school teenager daughter who's graduating, and I'm very concerned about Kelsey's future and frankly, where she goes to college. And part of my discussion as we're looking at colleges is talking to the leaders at this university about the safety and the environment for an African-American female going into your university. Like, I want to understand what's happening. And so to me, and for me, I'm holding folks accountable for their environment and how they ensure my daughter will feel safe. But let's just be clear, there's still a long ways to go. There's a lot of divisiveness that we can't even get in a room, not we, and talk about this issue without folks going crazy. Where's the civil discourse in our discussions that we need to bring back? And that's, I'd like to see that.
Yeah, and I also, if anybody's sitting there and thinking about your team and your organization and thinking about all the ways in which you're not perfect. The other thing, that the message I want to make sure that we recognize is that no organization has all this figured out and is doing this perfectly.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I just want to say that, because what we can often do is come to a conversation like this that is so important, and there is so much division and angst and energy around it, rightfully so. But to then immediately start to shaming ourselves and hitting ourselves as if our organization isn't entirely perfect. But at the same time, to not shut off from the idea of then, like, how do we stimulate progress? And how do we begin to then look at broader sense of the term diversity? You know, not just people of color, right? I've got CRSI folks that are on the call today that think about physical and developmental disabilities. And the people of that thinking about that broader in the sense of diversity and how important that is to the culture that we create. And so diversity, seeing it in many, many different layers, of course. But what are you seeing that are there practices, and tomorrow I may come to you in a second, of some best practices that you see? What are some things that companies are doing right now to say, hey, let's not just raise the level of consciousness, but let's begin to stimulate. Here's some things that are stimulating progress at an organizational level.
Well, one of the first things that, people say nothing about us without us, right? So you have to make sure you're including people who you're trying to address different issues, whether it's race, gender, orientation, ability, whatever. You need to make sure they're a part of the conversation. You can't make a decision about somebody that you don't have any kind of perspective or experience with. So that's number one. Number two, you got to think about intersectionality of it all, right? So I'm Black and I'm a female, and I actually have an invisible disability that no one can see. So there's a lot of things that are always on my mind when I'm talking to people in public, when I'm working with my teams. I'm like, how is this going to impact me? Or if my team member who might be different than me, how's that going to impact them? Let's get the buy-in to understand what we could do differently to accommodate, to celebrate, to recognize, to include. You have to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah. So I guess for my add on, I just want to go back to one thing that you said that I think is so important earlier, and that's when you start talking about inclusion. So one of the things that I have seen that has been helpful is organizations have defined what the work is. Diversity is not inclusion. So you can have diversity. That's easy. Doesn't mean you have inclusion. That's really where the work becomes, because how do you create an environment? How do you create a culture where people feel that they can bring their whole selves to the organization? They feel included. So really one at top is senior level is saying, let's define what it is. So we all know when we use the terms, we know what it is. Secondly, senior leaders are leading the work to make sure that they're looking at the policies, they're looking at the culture, they're looking at all the systems that are stopping them from being a kind of culture that invites the best and brightest. We had the conversation earlier around what's happening from the talent standpoint. This is a great opportunity for organizations to leverage DE&I to be able to attract talent that typically would never look at them. So I'm seeing that. I'm seeing organizations look at DE&I as a strategy to attract talent, to keep talent. And the last thing is that I'm looking at organizations that are saying, look, we don't have all the answers. To your point, how do we involve our team members, our employees to help us in solving the problem?
Many teams and organizations right now are realizing that they need to do both. They need to engage the minds and hearts of their people in person, where everyone in the room can experience the energy of congregating together and find clarity for the road ahead. And they also need to continue to find ways to engage the minds and hearts of their people virtually, with those who are working remotely or at a distance. So, if you are in the process of planning your next team meeting, company all-hands event, conference or culture summit, and are looking for support with a powerful keynote speech, facilitated team conversations that are the currency for change, or deeper development on leadership mindset and an intentional strategy for the culture you're trying to create, I hope you'll contact us at jasonvbarger.com, jasonvbarger.com. It is my privilege and our honor to partner with great people to provide support in these areas. We want to breathe oxygen into your leaders and throughout your organization so you can set the temperature you want for your culture. We look forward to connecting with you soon.
Yeah, I love that. So I've heard, I may get this wrong, but it said diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance.
Yeah.
And so I think that's powerful. For me, what I've seen, and frankly, what we've done at EY, we had our consulting group do an internal deep dive into all of our processes to look at where bias may exist. So in our recruitment process, where might bias come in play? Performance management, where might bias impact us? Promotions. And so from that wonderful deep dive, we actually have some things we're working on to get better. This is a constant thing of getting better, but we're looking at it. And guess what? It's not easy for an organization to say, oh, we may not be perfect, and we have things we have an opportunity to work on, but we're saying it, seeing that and saying it. And now it's about the work. What do you do from this point forward? But you got to do something. You can't just talk about it, lip service. I always tell my team, I go visit these companies and organizations, and I'll meet with their wonderful people and talk to them about their diversity strategy. And I'm like, that's just smoke and mirrors. They don't really care about this issue. But yeah, it looks great on the website. It looks great. I say I just got glossy brochure is a term I use. Mm-hmm. Don't be a glossy brochure organization when it comes to DEI. That is as much. Yeah, I mean we need real work here. And by the way, this is hard. But let's be clear. This is hard stuff. So expect to have some challenges, but you got to continue to push forward.
I'm interested, LT, I'm going to put you on the spot here. So if we can spotlight Lori Turner here, VP, where is she? Oh, there she is. Leadership for Educational Equity. You were part of the conversation last year. I'm interested in your thoughts, progress that you see, and any kind of reactions to what it is that you're hearing us talk about here.
Yeah, it's good to be with you all. Thank you so much for bringing me into this conversation. I'm missing this esteemed panel. It was really just an important conversation that stayed with me last year. What I love about where you all are centering this conversation right now is around inclusion. I will say, first of all, couldn't agree more that no organization is perfect, and working at an organization that has equity in the title, Leadership for Educational Equity, you can imagine where a lot of our work is both internally and externally. And I will say that my laser focus the last year has been on inclusion. I lead a team that is 70% people of color. Couldn't agree more. Like, the diversity part is the easy part, right? Like, it is the equity and the inclusion that is really challenging. And I think the most important thing to your framing, Jason, if culture is our competitive advantage, like, that is where the culture is built brick by brick in all of these important moments where people feel like they matter, they feel like they're valued, they feel like they're bringing important assets to each and every conversation. So I really appreciate lifting that up. And the thing that I think a lot about as a white leader is, how am I sharing power? Like, how am I stepping back on each and every decision that I'm making and ensuring that I'm bringing in a multitude of voices, given I have such rich and diverse experiences on my team. So that's really where the action has been. I wanted to name one thing that our organization does that has been really meaningful the last year. First, we get a lot of really positive feedback on our resource groups. So we have resource groups based on identity and affinity spaces, and that's a very powerful space for folks. But this year, we took a step further across spaces. We created this virtual dialogue series. It's actually called Building an Anti-Racist Organization, and we come together once a month. And for me, it's an important time to do some really active listening across teams, across lines of difference, across identities, and understand like how people are experiencing culture at our organization. And it's been a really powerful space where I've gotten a lot out of that. So very much appreciate this conversation. I think it is, I was thinking of this the whole time Tamara was speaking. I think it's all connected, and it has to be foundational to the culture and the organization, the DEI work. So thank you.
Thanks, LT. One of the things that's echoed in my brain ever, Kevin, you and I had many conversations about this. But your statement about when I have asked you, it said, hey, as a privileged white dude, right? Hopefully handsome, bald white dude. We've had this conversation, like, this isn't just people of color's conversation to carry. And that I need to be, and I still remember a phone call that you and I had. I'm pacing around out my front yard and talking to Ken about all this stuff and saying that we have to be people that are willing and desiring to be a part of the conversation. And your language, Kevin, is get in the boat, come get in the boat with me, right?
Right.
And so I'm interested too now as we're talking about setting the temperature for us individually and thinking about the thermostat, hopefully, that we all set. What are ways in which we can help set a temperature and be supportive in this kind of thinking, acting, and interacting? To not literally get in the boat with you. Like, what does that look like? And how do we, what would you say?
Yeah, so there's multiple boats. And the conversation that we did had the frame of reference for you, it had to do with allyship. And what we talked about was that during the times of George Floyd and others that were murdered, we had so many, and I'm talking about my community, so many African Americans that we had phone calls from our white counterparts and community leaders and partners saying, what can I do? How can I help you? I want to be an ally. And if you think about this from a river and I'm in my own rowboat, they're up on the banks looking down saying, hey, what can I do, Kev? How can I help you? And I'm like, well, first come down, get in the boat with me because my boat has holes in it. And if you could patch up some of these holes while I'm rowing, or why don't you row, let me patch up some of the holes so I don't sink, I don't drown. So the point around getting in the boat has to do with being an ally doesn't mean standing high and looking down. It means come down and get in the boat. But the challenge is that we all have our boats. Women have their boats. People of color have theirs. People with differing abilities. So that's the other part when I talked about what diversity is. Diversity is the multiple dimensions of everybody, and we all have to come together. And what has happened from a corporate standpoint, most of oppressed groups or disadvantaged groups are being pitted against each other for a small amount of resources. And I just think about myself when I ask for a budget for our employee resource groups. It's like, well, okay, here's X amount of dollars that you got to divide among so many people. And I'm like, well, let's start with the people first and see what they need, and then let me come back to you. So the point around that is let's all come together as one, understanding that we all have separate challenges. But from a business standpoint, if the common denominator is results at business, or if it's mission driven from a mission standpoint, let that be what drives us, because this is not a social cause. That's why the DE&I department is over here and the rest of the business over here, because it's not connected. DE&I drives revenue. DE&I drives mission.
I have two thoughts. First of all, one of the thoughts is around when you talk about what is leadership, what does leadership look like? It can't just look like the privileged white guy. I'm not going to lead like you, right? I'm going to lead from a different place. I'm highly emotional. I'll tell you right now, I'll drop a tear in a heartbeat, and I love every minute of it. But the reality of the situation is I should be able to be authentically myself and lead the way I lead, and that should be okay. There shouldn't be a standard of leadership that I can't fit into or I can't succeed in. So that's number one. I think number two, when you start thinking about the power dynamics that are at play, it's not a shifting of power from one to another, not like pie we talk about, right? So you can't get half the pie away, now you're losing half the pie. Think of it more like a candle that's lit. You're gonna share your flame and light this other candle. So you're not losing flame, you're actually improving the light in the room. Yeah. So if you think about, you have this power in this flame, light my candle, so then I can light Kevin's candle, and then Kevin can light Ken's candle. We can go around, and the illumination from sharing that power is immense.
We should have been lighting candles. Where were you earlier on that, Bob? Like candles for everybody, and we could have had a kumbaya. Ken, what are your thoughts?
Wait, I love that. I'm going to use that. I'm gonna give you credit once, and then I said. I want to come back to something. This word privilege, because words matter in this space, and you often hear the white male privilege gets thrown out all the time, but people don't have an appreciation for, at least in my mind, what that means. When I say that, here's what I mean. I'm not saying that Jason didn't have to work hard, didn't struggle throughout to get to where he is today. What I'm saying is, the color of his skin probably didn't impact his ability throughout. But I'm not taking away how hard you had to work, the sacrifice you had to make, because people, when you say white privilege, they're like, oh, I had to work hard too. I get that. But what I'm saying is the color of your skin didn't impede your progress or make you have to run an extra lap or do an extra thing to get there. So I want to be really clear on that because words matter here. And then people take those words and say, well, it's not about, that's why I'm keeping my flame. I'm not lighting your flame. And my flame, I had to get someone to light mine too. I get that. We are in this together. So I wanted to make that point.
It's a great distinction. I appreciate that. Howard, you got your hand up, and I know, man, I'm sure you got a great perspective on this.
Well, I don't. I'd like to tell you I did. I don't. I know what works in organizations, and that's models. And as I listen to all of you talk, I'm an old guy. I'm 77, so my world is different than the young people of today. But I understand all of this intellectually. But I don't know what it looks like. I mean, specifically what it looks like. I don't know what it feels like, right? I can't put myself in your shoes. And I think there needs to be more, it needs to be more in depth on this. It's easy to use, what's the word I want? It's, to use words that, like the flame and all those things. But when you get down to it, the issue inside an organization for the people working in an organization, they don't know how to live their life, do this. They don't know how to bring it about. They don't even know what it looks like when it's right, and that is really critical. The voices need to talk about that. When you're teaching a child how to do something, right? You don't talk in esoteric terms. You say, here's what it looks like, and here's how you know when you're there or when you're making progress. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that from this group. No, really good.
Howard, as always, great tee up, because, and many of the folks, again, on this call are going to recognize, when we start with the term leadership, that language matters. We define, when we say leadership, what is it that we actually mean? And we have to define that because we got to make sure we're speaking the same language. Same thing with culture, and absolutely for this conversation, when we say those things, what is it that we mean, and what can it begin to look like in action and behavior, and how can we create an ecosystem where we're learning and developing all this and modeling it, I think is what the question was.
Yep. Can I jump in?
Please.
All right. So Howard, I'm a former P&Ger, so I talk in threes. There's always three examples of you with P&G. So here's what it looks like. Example number one, when my white male president, who's in his mid-30s, sees something on the news, and I get a text at 11 o'clock at night, and it's something about a racist act that happened. I get a text saying, Kevin, I'm not sure, but I think this is something we may want to address in our senior leadership meeting tomorrow. That's leadership chiming in saying, Kevin, what do you think? Because he saw it through his own eyes. So we have that dialogue. And that was very different than 3 years ago when I started. Example number two, when I have white males and females in our organization that lead diversity initiatives in our organization. Not me, not my team, and they lead it with competencies. They lead it with confidence. They're leading it through their lens. That's what it looks like. Thirdly, when our CEO, who has been with our organization now 20-something years, invites me to meetings that he never, ever would have invited me before, because he sees the added value that I bring to a discussion about race, gender, or anything under the DE&I lens. So those are three examples of what it looks like. And what it feels like is the same thing that it feels like to everybody else in this room when you feel included. It's exhilarating. You now have meaningful work because people value you.
I'd say what it feels like is just what Kevin said, putting yourself in that position. Like, have you ever felt a sense of belonging? What does that feel like to you? What did that do for your confidence? What did that do for your drive? Like, think about that. And then also, anybody that is different from you, no matter who you are, don't question whether or not they have the competencies to do something. If they've come to the table, they are already qualified. Don't think that, oh, well, I would love to hire more diverse people, but I don't know if we can find somebody that's qualified. I literally heard that in multiple organizations that I worked in. You're already putting a bias on it, and you're already thinking this probably is not going to work out, or we're only doing this for a diversity hire quota. You've got to address that bias that might be in your head, or if you heard one of your leaders say it, you're like, hey, you know, maybe we gotta rethink what you just said, or why? Can you tell me why you think that? You know, address it. Call them in. You don't have to call them out, because calling out gets all kind of danger up. But if you say, I want to call you in because I want to help you, I want to educate you, I want to protect you from yourself right now from making a mistake. So if you are open to hearing that and taking that feedback, processing it, and then acting accordingly, that's what it feels like.
I love all that. I think it's also, to me, Howard, about the environment. I think so much we get hindered by fear when it comes to this work. And I'll just point on you again. So the fear of the white male to give feedback to a black female, and concern because you may say in your mind the wrong thing and be labeled as you fill in the blank. But yet you have a responsibility to your black female manager to give her the feedback she needs to get better. But there's a lot of fear right now. So an organization has to create the right environment that Jason feels very comfortable to give that feedback. So I think there's so much of what you guys said. That's why this work is complex. We got to understand that, and we need to give ourselves some grace, because no one's perfect at this. I make mistakes all the time. I get better, but we need to give each other grace. This word respect.
I love that, and I'm giving each other grace, and I think that helps alleviate a little bit of the fear, or that you may stumble upon the wrong word or say the wrong thing, and certainly words matter.
Yep.
And they can do a lot of damage and hurt people for sure. But I heard somebody say this recently that I thought was fantastic, is that we need to, as leaders, practice more grace with people, that when they, not when they say something that there's damage that is really bad, hard to come back from. But when they stumble along the wrong word, when they maybe don't see the bias and act a certain way, but we can come back from that. But we need to give people stickers, not tattoos. I love that. I love that image, that when we make mistakes, that it's okay to point it out and say, hey, here's a sticker, but I'm not labeling it. It's not a tattoo. You're not now
I like that.
Racist, homophobic, sexist, whitest, whatever the term is.
Baldish. I mean, whatever you got.
Keep going. I got a lot of illness to me. So stickers, not tattoos, and giving ourselves some grace. It seems there's something in there that seems to be helpful for us to stimulate progress.
So Jason, the point that was just made, let me take it a step further to the comment around what it looks like.
Yeah.
So you gave the reference of an African-American female with a white male maybe saying something. When you know that it's there, when you see it, when you feel it, it's when that African-American female can say to you, Jason, this is how you make me feel.
Yeah.
And you receive that. Versus what happens now is that people go in their separate corners. That dialogue happens with HR, or it happens with somebody else. It doesn't happen directly with you. So when you have a culture where DE&I is actually relevant and it's alive and it's breathing, is when you and I can have a dialogue and say, Jason, here's how you make me feel during that conversation. And it's not about us from a race difference. It's just how you make me feel from a humanity standpoint, and us being able to dialogue.
And me being able to do that with you.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
A two-way street.
Yes.
Of us being able to, which again, this is emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
This is the heart of our developing our own emotional intelligence, and in language I would use, recalibrating our thermostat. That in moment by moment, how is it that we recognize how I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing in the moment, and what am I going to regulate my own behavior? And then my social competency of being able to read and recognize your emotions and how you might be feeling, and then realizing that there's a two-way street here.
And not just that, creating psychological safety and brave spaces to have that vulnerable conversation, that emotional conversation. Because without that safety, people are not going to want to do it.
No doubt.
Agreed. I'm big on emotional intelligence personally as a leader. I think that's critically important.
Yeah.
You just have to have it. Trust is also the other piece, that in relationships, you got to have trust to do that, to have that kind of conversation and dialogue that Kevin mentioned. Without trust, it's difficult to have that.
I could talk about this all day, but I'm trying to keep us on schedule here too. But I also want to make sure that we open it for questions. If there are people that have a question, either online or in the room here, a question that they think would contribute to this. Yeah, Bethany. Yeah.
So we're a smaller team, and we've been recently putting a lot more intention around our DEI initiatives. But in an effort to include all the team voices, we're also, being a small team, we're not a very diverse team. So I think I'm curious about what is the balance between including the voices to represent all the groups you want to support, but without kind of like assigning that heavy lift to team members that maybe don't want that to carry, you know, like maybe that's not the role they want to play, but I guess, yeah, that balance of being inclusive, but offering the choice, I guess, when you just don't have a lot of diversity on your team.
I would challenge you to say, what kind of diversity? You don't have racial diversity, ethnic diversity, what kind of diversity? Because diversity is multiple things, right?
Minimal of all of it.
Right. So now that's the first question I would have is, what kind of diversity are you missing on the team? The second part of that is, again, I don't want you to hire somebody to bring somebody else in, right? Because that doesn't work. I think part of it is question whether or not you have an environment that supports diversity and inclusion. And that might be a hard, reflective thing to do, but set that first. And then if you find out things that are not as inclusive as possible, then what are you going to start to do to change?
I love what you just said around the question. And if we can use this as a teachable moment, you have diversity. And I think when you said that, most people in the room were like, ooh, she talking about race? What is she talking about? You have diversity. And if you don't acknowledge that, then what that says is diversity is, and let's call it what it is. And if it's black, female, or whatever, it's exclusive of everyone else. We have diversity in this room. Now, do we have all the dimensions of diversity that we need? Maybe not. And that's a key understanding, because I've been in situations where it was a room full of all white males. They had diversity. They just didn't have all the different dimensions. Secondly, you can go outside your organization if you want different perspectives and get those different perspectives that you want from individuals that represent the dimensions that you're looking for.
I love that.
Yep.
Hey, shameless plug at EY, we have a people advisory services consulting practice. We're happy to help. I'll let you say that. All right, we got you.
I'm so aware of time. I wish we could just keep going. But your thermostat word. I'm interested in your thermostat word when you think about the year ahead. And if you were to, a word or two or three that is you're trying to hold out in front of yourselves. We heard Tamara talk about possibility. What's your thermostat word?
You said I can have three, right? All right. All right. No, right. Actually, mine is managing by requirements.
Say more about that.
Oftentimes, from a management standpoint, we manage by traditions, preferences, or conveniences. With all of those have a bias to them. And also in these times of culture change, I'll just give you a very quick example. For us, working from home is that would never happen. We're sports and entertainment. We put on shows. That was really a preference, a convenience, and a tradition. So when you manage by requirements, is what are the requirements to actually do the job? What's required? Then we build the systems to support that and the expectations.
My word is liberation. And I think about freedom of thought, freedom to be yourself, freedom away from bondage, from oppression, just being able to fully reach that potential we've been talking about. How do you free yourself? How do you help people free themselves to be able to do that?
I got so much I want to talk to you about.
Me too.
Right.
Anyway, but make a note of that. We're going to come back to that at some point. Yeah.
Like Kevin, I got like a ton of words I really want to say, but I think for me, it's just, I call it differential moderation, because I think one size doesn't fit one when it comes to your team. And I think you got to be really thoughtful about it, because, you've got to recognize people who they are and how do you help moderate the temperature accordingly. So one size, doesn't fit all. One size fits one. So that's what I would do.
Before we clap for these wonderful people that are here, let me just say this. Again, no human is perfect. No team is perfect. No organization is perfect. I'm yet to find it. And so the reality is the future of work and the future of being human in the world. I can't control everything else, but all I can do is come back to my own thermostat and say, well, what is the temperature that I want to set? And how we begin to stimulate progress is how everyone in this room and beyond begins to say, in the way I show up and the way I think and act and interact, I'm going to begin to set a slightly different temperature. And over time, that's going to continue to invite others to do the same. And what I'll just say to you all is thank you for your friendship and your ability and willingness to have this conversation. And for whatever it's worth, I'm trying my best to set that temperature and be in the boat. And trying to be a voice that does not have it figured out by any stretch of the imagination. But I know it's what we all need. So Amen. Would you clap for these folks?
Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using, and share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, the spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to you and your organization, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com, jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we are all ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.